everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I actually wanted to do a bit of a discussion about semi-hydro or self-watering with LECA, setups that involve LECA, my thoughts on them and the pros and cons, and what I'm currently kind of growing using this method, because this is a method that's quite polarizing in that some people absolutely love it and get on with it with no problems, and some people really hate it and are quite negative about it. And I think there's things to be said for both sides of the argument. So I kind of wanted to give you a more balanced maybe perspective on the way I feel about this growing method and what I keep in it and what I won't keep in it and what works for me, and kind of my ideas on why it doesn't work for some people in some environments. So as you can see, I've got a selection of orchids in front of me, and these are a representative selection of the types of orchids that I keep in semi-hydroponic setups with LECA or self-watering pots with LECA. Now, unfortunately, I've realised that I don't actually have any Phalaenopsis complex hybrids in clear pots where I can show you the root systems. I have some in semi-transparent pots, so I've grabbed one of those, but the rest of them are in clear pots, so we can talk about the root systems. You can kind of see evidence that they're doing well rather than me just saying they're doing well. And I'll talk a little bit about each type of orchid that I keep in semi-hydro. So if we start off with the Phalaenopsis types, I keep my species and novelty hybrid Phalaenopsis and my complex hybrid Phalaenopsis in semi-hydro with LECA or self-water with LECA. Now, there are differences between those two growing methods. Although they might be small, there are distinct differences. Semi-hydro with LECA involves a reservoir being filled with water, which is this section at the bottom, and then the clay pellets, or LECA pellets, wick this water up to the top of the pot. So you've got a constantly moist but airy environment with lots of air pockets that the roots can breathe in but still receive a constant supply of water and nutrients. So in this way you never have a gap between when the plant dries out and can no longer have nutrients supplied and the next watering. It's just a constantly moist environment. Now, self-watering with LECA tries to replicate this using a wick system. So I'll use this as an example. So some self-watering pots are pretty much semi-hydro pots where they just have kind of cones going down into the bottom, and those cones have LECA pellets in, and that small proportion of LECA pellets is the reservoir contacted portion. Now, where you use a wick system, you have wicks that go down into the reservoir of water and they go up into the pot. I've got 2 wicks in this pot to try and maintain even levels of moisture. And those wicks obviously remain constantly wet, which then transfers water to the surrounding LECA pellets, and then they in turn transfer water to the top layer of LECA pellets. To me, self-watering pots like this are a bit more of a dry environment than semi-hydro pots, because you have less LECA beads that are in contact with the water supply at any one time. So there's slightly less water transmitted, in my personal opinion, and what I've found from transitioning orchids between the two. So those are the two setups that I use. Now, as I said, my species and complex hybrid Phalaenopsis are in both of these sort of setups. Mainly I do use the semi-hydro with LECA for them because of the size of the orchids, but a couple of them I have in these little self-watering pots with the reservoir gauge, which tells me when they need watering. And this type of pot is like the cone system, where it just has cones that go down to the reservoir. So you've got a few cones that have LECA pellets submerged, and then that wicks the water up. But I quite like them because they have this gauge level, so I don't have to check on them constantly. And they can be quite thirsty. I tend not to check the reservoirs anyway. I water once a week. I kind of know how much water they're using in between. And if I check one orchid, that'll give me a representative example of how full the reservoir is. So I've never had any issues transitioning Phalaenopsis types into LECA of any kind. Now, I know that some people do report a period where the orchid needs to adjust. And this is supposed to be very common with this method. I've not personally experienced it, but if you look on the first Ray's board, which is Ray Barcolow's semi-hydro board, and he's basically the originator of the semi-hydro concept with orchids, as far as I believe. So he has really detailed kind of transitioning instructions, basically. And that's where I've got a lot of my information from, because I think it's best to just go straight to the source rather than looking at other people's interpretations of it. And the interpretations are very valid and they give you a lot more detailed information about the different environments that works in. But I think when you start off, it's good to just go and read his website, because he has spent many years perfecting this method. And he suggests when you first put an orchid in semi-hydro, obviously time it with new root growth and the old root system will die off. Put the plant onto a heat mat as well to speed up new root growth around the heat around the root zone. And in addition to this, he recommends using seaweed extract. He has a particular type of seaweed extract which he sells, which is a very high purity one, which I can't get hold of, so I just use Maxicrop seaweed extract. And the seaweed extract has growth hormones in, so again you're speeding up that new root system transitioning. So the new root system goes down into the LECA, and this is already adapted to the LECA environment. The old root system will die off because it was not previously adapted to this sort of self-watering or constantly moist environment. So that's kind of the idea behind it. Now personally, with Phalaenopsis types, I've never experienced the old roots dying off really, but that could be a number of factors. And obviously the roots are adapted to the environment they've been in prior, so it depends on your watering frequency. If they're used to a very dry environment, if you're not watering very often at all, and then if you're really letting them dry out in between watering, and then you put them into a self-watering system where the LECA is always moist, then that's a major change that the root system can't adapt to, because those roots grow and adapt as they're growing, and once they've finished kind of that growth stage, they are transitioned to be adapted to that specific environment and they can't change their structure. So if you put them into a drastically different environment, they will die off. Now, again, as I say, I've not experienced this, but it's something to be very aware of, because I think that's one major thing that people, when they're trying semi-hydro, they try it and all the roots die off and they think, oh, this is absolutely awful. That may be a normal part of the transitioning process, but it's also very distressing to set your orchid back by losing the root system. So I can understand both sides of that argument, that it may be a necessary adaptation process, but also, do you really want to set your orchid back by losing the whole root system and having it need to grow a new root system? So if you're going to do it, then it's best to transition when you've got new root growth, but that's kind of always the case anyway. So that's kind of my perspective on that. And my Phalaenopsis types all do really well, and you can see growing them in this way, because they've got a constant supply of nutrients and moisture available, they grow very rapidly, for me at least. And you can see all the happy sap on this particular flower spike. My Samira is doing really well in this setup. So another type of orchid that I keep in the system is the complex hybrid Phalaenopsis, which pretty much are bulletproof, for me at least. And again, as I said, I don't actually have any in clear pots to show you, but you can kind of see the outline of the root system in this pot. You can see root there going down into the reservoir, root there, root there, root there. There's another outline of a root there. You can see kind of a root tip there, kind of in the reservoir. And it's fine for them to go into the reservoir if they grow into the reservoir and adapted to that environment. The reservoir levels go up and down, so they're not constantly submerged in water, but they are adapted to that. So it's fine for them to do that. And again, it's that adaptation process. So if you put aerial roots straight into a self-watering system, the aerial roots would die off because they're adapted to dry environments. So that is my Phalaenopsis Happy Fangsa, and you can see we've got another flower spike starting on that one. The other major type of orchid that I keep in semi-hydro or self-watering in LECA are Cattleyas, and they do really well for me in this setup. So this is the Cattleya SLC Jewel Box Dart Waters that I got as a seedling from Orchid Garden, and you can kind of see the transition of growth. And the latest 3 growths that it's put out, I'm thinking we're approaching flowering size now. And you can kind of see the root system. It's just kind of filling the pot, so I do need to repot this at some stage, which again is a major advantage of semi-hydro with LECA or self-watering with LECA, because LECA is inorganic, so it's never going to break down. You literally just need to take it out of the old pot, put it into a new pot and fill around with more LECA. There's never any stress about removing all the old media from the root system. And this is my Cattleyas Tokyo Magic. We have got, oh, I didn't notice this, but this leaf is being rather strangled by its sheath. Let me just take that off. Anyway, that's corrected now, but that is a shame because that new growth is going to be, I might just do that. I'm gonna need to go along. I'll do that separately, but I'm gonna need to go along apparently and free these new growths from their sheaths, because apparently the sheaths are strangling them. Usually I do this sooner, but I just didn't realise that these had grown that fast. So yeah, this has got 3 directions of growth. We've got another new growth starting at the bottom of there. This new growth with the damaged leaf, and another new growth here. And got a really good root system on this orchid. Didn't really have any problems at all transitioning this one. So this is actually one of the older roots that's branched out. It was in semi-hydro with LECA to start with, and then I transitioned it to a self-watering pot because it was drinking the reservoir dry too fast, and with a self-watering pot you get a larger reservoir to play around with. So yeah, that one's doing really well. And all of my Cattleyas are in, the smaller ones are in semi-hydro, the larger ones are in self-watering with LECA, and they all do exceptionally well for me in this setup. I've not had any problems at all. What I'm finding with some of the species is they're a little bit more fussy than the complex hybrid Cattleyas, but they're still doing well. I just need to watch out for the dry top layer a little bit more with the species Cattleyas. And that's again something else that I seem to get a lot that other people don't, is that quite dry top layer. So say this kind of top layer at the top stays dry, and then you have a more moist environment towards the bottom because of that wicking effect. And that layering effect isn't actually as bad with clay media as it is with something like bark, where you get a lot of layering. But it does cause a bit of a problem because that dry top layer can be very dry with LECA. So you do need to watch out for that as well. And it is dependent on your environment completely. So I think each, obviously, there's no universal growing method, and you need to kind of monitor in your environment what this is doing. So I've talked about the Cattleyas, and another type of orchid that I do grow in semi-hydro with LECA, or self-watering with LECA now, the Rhynchostylis Giganteas, and they seem to enjoy a lot more moisture than their other Foundation. So I repotted this one, and I did film it kind of at the start of my YouTube channel, and this was originally in a chunky charcoal mix when I bought it, and I put it straight into semi-hydro with LECA after a bit of indecision and having a few other factors that kind of made that decision for me with another of the Rhynchostylis Gigantea that I have. So I did go into it in that video, so I'll link you down below. And I repotted these from semi-hydro with LECA to self-watering with LECA, and this one did actually stall a bit. It stopped growing its new leaf. I think that is because the self-watering system is a little bit drier than the semi-hydro system, which I didn't really consider until I actually did this repotting and stalled this orchid. But we do now have some new growths, some new roots starting to emerge. One there, and there's also one there. So the root system is doing really well for this orchid. I was actually a little bit worried that it was too dry, so I did unpot it to check it and found that the roots had just kind of exploded. And obviously you can see them now that they're starting to reach the side of the pot, even though I repotted it into quite a large pot compared to what it was originally in. So that could also be another reason that it's stalled, because it was a slightly drier environment and a bigger pot, possibly with a drier top layer. So yeah, that one's doing really well. So hopefully I should get some flower spikes this autumn. So I also keep my one Paphiopedilum in semi-hydro with LECA, and it's got a lot of Seramis in this mix because Paphiopedilums, from what I've read, like a much more moist environment. And I've actually just noticed that it's got 2 new growths. So it had one fan when I got it. It produced this fan, and then it's produced these 2 as well. So it's producing 2 new growths now, which is good. So yeah, I'm happy with that. I didn't actually realise until I got it out for this video that it was starting those 2 new growths. So finally, I do also keep a couple of Oncidiums in this setup. And this one I've actually just noticed has a flower spike. So this is a Cambria intergeneric cross. It's got a beautiful red flower, and this is kind of the only one which did really well in like the semi-hydro kind of system, and I repotted it with you guys a little while ago, and you can see already the root system is growing very well. So yeah, that one's doing really well in the self-watering with LECA. And obviously we've got that flower spike from that maturing new growth. And I do also keep my Sharry baby in a mixture of LECA and Seramis. And the Sharry baby is pretty bulletproof. I tried this with a lot of other Oncidiums and they did not like it at all. So I've got a few that are still in there that did okay, but as a general rule, my Oncidiums didn't really like Semi-Hydro with LECA because it was too dry in my environment. Which is funny because it implies a constantly moist environment, but for me it is actually quite dry and airy. You can see, if I lift this up, quite a substantial root system on this one, going down into the reservoir, and it's sucking the reservoir dry so quickly at the moment. So yeah, that one is doing really well. It's put out 3 new growths so far this year. So yeah, I'm definitely happy with that. And I'll be keeping that one in organic media in the semi-hydro with LECA and Seramis. But a lot of my other Oncidiums, as I say, I've had to transition them to sphagnum moss mixes because they didn't do so well in this environment, just because of that dryness and the airiness of it. So I've talked about the types of orchids that I keep in semi-hydro with LECA. I also have quite a lot of dendrobiums in semi-hydro with LECA, and my dendrobium speciosum is actually just taken off. The root growth is amazing on it. So it's really enjoying semi-hydro with LECA. There are some orchids, as I've mentioned, that I can't keep in my environment in this because of the airiness. And also there are some orchids that I'm not really willing to try in this because I've tried them in the past and it doesn't really work so well, or just because when you buy an orchid with a really well established, really good root system that's adapted to a very dry environment, for example a Vanda that you buy with like a 2 foot, 3 foot long root system, if you then put that into semi-hydro with LECA, that root system is more likely than not going to die because Vandas are grown bare root in nurseries really. So I keep them by growing them in chunky bark mixes. That kind of, I get away with that because it's still very airy and not very moist, but if I put them into semi-hydro with LECA, the root system would just die off and it would have to grow a new root system and it would set the orchid back, and I'm just not willing to do that. Often when I get Cattleyas, they don't have great root systems anyway. It just seems to be my luck with Cattleyas. Although recently I've been buying much better specimens. And yeah, they all do absolutely fine. I don't lose the old root systems. The new root systems grow really quickly into it and adapt and are fine. So that's my kind of take on semi-hydro with LECA and the orchids that I keep in it. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on is why it fails. Now for me, it fails for some orchids because of that dryness, but for other people I've heard that it works for a year and then it completely stops working, or again that all the roots die when you put it into it, which could be a transitional issue that people kind of aren't willing to stick out because, I mean, let's face it, it is very distressing to watch all the old roots die, and for me I'm also not willing to do that. So if I notice that starting to happen, I would switch the setup also. So I'm completely in agreement with that. It's not worth really setting your orchid back. But another issue that I kind of think is maybe a bit less talked about is the pH issue with semi-hydro with LECA. So what I've done is I've got some LECA that I've prepared for potting up some new orchids. And I just thought we'd pH it and look at the TDS compared to my tap water together and discuss kind of this issue. So this has been rinsed initially. When you get it, it's incredibly dusty. It's just the way it's manufactured. It generates a lot of dust from the clay pellet processing, I guess. So I do an initial rinse, and I rinse it a few times. I do like 3 or 4 rinses where I fill this up, put the LECA in, fill it up with water, drain it out through a colander, and I just keep rinsing it several times. I then do an overnight soak, and I do all of these in tap water because I don't really want to waste my filtered water on it. So at the moment this is sitting in tap water. It's sat overnight in tap water, and then I've done a final rinse, so it's in fresh water now. So for comparison, if we just firstly measure the TDS of my tap water, because we have to bear in mind that obviously this isn't in filtered water, so it's got a high TDS anyway. So my tap water TDS is 254 parts per million, and the TDS of the LECA water is 257 parts per million. So I've rinsed off all of the salts and solutes that are produced during the manufacturing process. So in terms of TDS, it's absolutely fine. Now if we look at pH, pH of my tap water, 7.7-ish. pH of the LECA, 7.33. So it's actually lowered the pH slightly for my brand of LECA. Usually it stays very similar, but we'll go with this because this is the most thorough test that I've done probably on it. So it does lower the pH slightly. That's fine for me. I measure the pH of what's coming out of my pots regularly. So I'm always pHing to have a good balanced pH in the pot of around 6, which allows for good nutrient absorption. Now, if you don't pH and you're using LECA, which has a pH, say it has a pH of around 7.5, that's absolutely fine. That's not going to do your orchid any harm. However, long term, you might get less optimal nutrient absorption, which may explain possibly why some people say that it works for them for the first year and then long term it's not a viable growing method. Maybe if they're not pHing, that's the only explanation I can kind of think of. For me, I've been growing in semi-hydro with LECA for around 2 years now, and I've not run into any of these issues, but again, I do pH, so I do wonder if it is a pH issue where people long-term are struggling to grow their orchids in it, whether it's just that the pH is, you know, orchids like a more acidic pH, so it's on the higher side really of what an orchid would prefer. And over time that will affect nutrient absorption. So you might start to notice the orchid going downhill if you're kind of using a higher pH media. And I do know that some brands of LECA do have a higher pH than what I've just measured. So my LECA is absolutely fine, but I've seen posts from some other YouTubers saying that their LECA has an extremely high pH. I'm using the Canna Aqua Hydro Garden brand LECA. It comes in like a 45 litre bag, so it's really good value, and that's kind of why I chose it. Also, it's got nice uniform bead size. Sometimes you buy LECA and it's really like rough and not uniform, so I quite like this brand LECA for that reason as well. So yeah, those are kind of my thoughts maybe on why it doesn't work long term for some people, or why it doesn't work for some people. And everyone's got their own growing method. There is no universal growing method, so it's completely up to you what you find works in your environment. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what works in my environment. And again, this is something that I think used with caution. It's maybe more of a risky growing method, but long term the benefits are really quite exceptional because you're never going to have to worry about breaking down media. It's just something to really be aware of, I think, when you're transitioning your orchids to this. And I hope that I've kind of given a balanced debate as to the pros and cons of LECA, and I've tried to consider kind of what I've heard from other people as well, not just my own personal views. So obviously I'll provide updates via this channel as to the longer term, sort of 2 years plus updates that I have with growing in semi-hydro with LECA, and this all could change. I could find that after 3 years I really dislike it as a growing method. I've definitely hit some limits with it in terms of Oncidiums and some species orchids which are just a lot more fussy with their requirements, and really dislike it for whatever reason, whether it's the dryness or just the texture of it, because it is quite a rough texture. It's not particularly gentle on roots, and if you're repotting aggressively, it can be quite aggressive towards roots. So you do need to also be careful of that, because it's got that rough texture and that could damage roots. So I'm kind of constantly learning and adapting my process to what I'm finding improves the setup. So I'll definitely keep you updated with my progress, but those are my thoughts after a few years of growing in semi-hydro with LECA and self-watering with LECA. And I hope that that's been useful, and as I say, I hope that it's been like a balanced kind of discussion, and I'm definitely interested to hear what other people's experiences are with growing in semi-hydro with LECA or self-watering with LECA, and whether you've run into any other problems that I haven't discussed, because I think it's really easy to say, oh, that doesn't work for me, but it's really interesting to know why it hasn't worked for some people. And I was speaking to someone recently who lived in India, and it was very, very hot, and she tried putting a Cattleyas in semi-hydro, and all of the roots just like desiccated and died because they just dried out so rapidly, because the environment was so hot and the humidity was so low that wicking action wasn't efficient at all, and it just killed off the root system. So they were trying in a water culture as the next step because semi-hydro was too dry. So yeah, there's always, with different environments, different factors to consider, and this works for me in my environment, but it might not work for everybody, as I said. So I'm interested to hear any comments that you guys might have, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did and want to see more from me, then give this video a like or subscribe to my channel for regular orchid updates, and I will see you guys later. Bye!